and you can't really explain it. In a certain sense, there's a mystery at the heart of the relationship between Bosie and Oscar. I think Bosie was incredibly handsome, very sexy as far as Oscar was concerned. He also, represented the ideal of gay beauty as it existed at that time, which derived almost entirely from the classics and from their, reading of the Greek, ancient Greek and Roman Latin texts. And, there was the sort of ideal of Narcissus and the beautiful golden youth. And in many ways, that's exactly how Bosie seemed to Oscar. But, that apart, it's still a mystery. He fell in love with him.
People are often puzzled by what it was that Oscar saw in Bosie aside from his beauty. And you might say, well, beauty is enough. Beauty can easily be enough. But when you're talking about a man with such profound intelligence and insight, was Oscar Wilde so shallow as simply to fall for a pair of beautiful eyes and lovely lips and a beautiful body and shining hair? Was that all it was? And I don't think it can have been. One thing I think one has to believe absolutely is that Bosie loved Oscar and Oscar loved Bosie, each in their own way, and they did, and they needed each other. It's pretty clear that they stopped having sex very early on, and that in some ways Wilde was right when he said in court, he talked about, the love that dare not speak its name, and he was right that his relationship with Bosie was a rather Socratic, a Platonic one. He was a teacher. He saw this young, beautiful, sort of ideal form, as it were, and believed he could make something of him. He couldn't, of course, because Bosie was what we would now call I suppose, an abused child. Came from what we would call a dysfunctional family. His father would kick him away when he was very small. He was shown no affection. His parents were split, broken up, And on top of that, he came from an old aristocratic family with a lot of money, just as the aristocracy was sort of coming towards the end of its great domination of world affairs and British affairs. And he was that useless thing, a younger son, who never has a role to find. Traditionally, it's the church or the military. I don't think Bosie would have been suited for either of those. And as one of the characters in the film says, the empire was not built by men like Bosie Douglas. And Wilde was drawn to him, I think, also because he had this extraordinary quality of boldness, that for all his faults, he had a kind of courage, which was to do with his aristocracy, to do with the fact that he was accustomed to being shown deference and to being able to display eccentricity and difference in a way that the middle classes, who yearned for absolute acceptance and respectability, were not. And the aristocracy have always been able to be fluorescent and extraordinary in their manners and flamboyant in their behavior, because they've got nothing to prove. They don't have to establish their status and their right to respect, because it's given in title, at least so they imagine. Whereas the middle classes are always desperate to conform and are always much more absurdly puritanical than either the working or the upper classes. And I think Wilde was drawn to that, because although he was an artist and a bohemian, and in that sense strictly déclassé, as they would say, he was outside of class, part of him was bourgeois, and Bosie knew that. Part of him was conventional, Oscar. Part of him wanted to be accepted by society. The other part, the Irish maverick part, wanted to be an outsider, a mocking commentator. But another part yearned for acceptance. And I understand that completely. I know just what that feels like. I mean, I'm much the same. I think a lot of people are. That while they mock and scorn bourgeois values and the Puritanism and judgmental attitudes of bourgeois morality, a part of them deeply wants to belong. And I think that's central to their relationship.
I don't want to sit here. I want to sit there.
You heard what Lord Alfred said?
I want everyone to look at us. I want everyone to say, look, there's Oscar Wilde with his board.
So, what should we let people see us eating?
Foie gras and lobster. And champagne.
For two. We do everything together.
Very good, Mr. Wilde.
I think Bosie did control Oscar, really. I mean, it's certainly true that when Oscar and Bosie were together, Oscar couldn't write. All his plays, which he wrote while with Bosie, were done when Bosie was away. He was either sent off to Egypt by his parents, or he'd had a row with Oscar, and Oscar used the month or 3 weeks or whatever to do a huge amount of writing. When they were together, he would come round. If they hadn't spent the night together, he would come round in the morning and he would get lunch from Oscar, and it would always be the Perrier-Jouet champagne, and it would always be the right food at the right place, always the most expensive. Oscar would shower him with gifts, and Oscar put up with his sulks and his tantrums for an enormous length of time. And he knew that it was harming him as an artist. He knew that. But he indulged Bosie much as a father indulges a child, and much as lovers indulge their lovers everywhere.
Whenever I want to do anything, you say you can't afford it. But you give all those renters cigarette cases.
But I've lavished presents on you. Every penny I've earned from my play, I have spent on you.
Oh, I'm sure you've been counting. You're so mean and penny-pinching and middle-class. All you can think about is your bank balance.
Bosie, for God's sake, this is intolerable.
No gentleman ever has the slightest idea what his bank balance is.
Bosie could attack him and could get under his skin, and that also was attractive. So there is a certain masochistic side in that. Bosie could seem to be, at times, a rather destructive truth-teller to Oscar. So there were many bases to the relationship. I think, actually, Oscar was the best parent that Bosie never had.
I think he wanted from Oscar a reliability, which he did not get in his own family. He was smothered with love, perhaps not altogether happily, by his mother. And his father was this lunatic who beat him and was tyrannical and didn't love him at all. And he and his brothers were all suffered very much from their background. And Oscar was, in fact, a very sort of solid, not only physically, but also emotionally, solid character for Bosie, I think.
I thought you might like something to celebrate your return.
Oscar.
When I saw them in the window, they begged me on their knees to make them yours.
When Oscar could charm the birds out of the trees, even when he met the Marquis of Queensberry, Bosie's father, who was a terrible bully and with as I say, absolutely lacking all restraint, he charmed him. And when Bosie talked to his father afterwards, I mean, they sat, Marquis of Queensberry and Oscar Wilde sat in the Café Royal for 4 hours in delighted conversation.
Where do you stand on cremation?
I'm not sure I have a position.
I'm for it. I wrote a poem. When I am dead, cremate me. That's how it begins. When I am dead, cremate me. What do you think of that for an opening line?
It's challenging.
Well, I'm a challenging sort of man. That's why people don't like me. I don't go along with the ordinary ways of thinking.
Then we are exactly alike. Another glass of brandy.
The question of why Oscar allowed himself to take up the challenge of the Marquis of Queensberry is extremely interesting. What I think actually happened was this. I think that Bosie was absolutely determined to get his father. He wanted revenge. There's hardly any more powerful emotion, particularly in somebody like that. And he dragged Oscar into the family quarrel. And I've seen this happen in life often, that people, outsiders, get drawn into this psychological whirlpool of unhappy families. And I think that's what happened to Oscar. I think that he got to a stage where he couldn't say no. I don't think he initiated the case. I think Bosie did.
Why did Oscar fall into Queensberry's trap, which is what it was? Queensberry wanted Oscar Wilde to sue him. He wanted to become such a nuisance that Wilde would sue. And it was, as Wilde called it, a terrible net that he got ensnared in. I think one of the reasons was that Bosie's older brother, Lord Drumlanrig, Francis Douglas, had apparently committed suicide on the eve of his wedding because there'd been a scandal in the making about his relationship with Lord Rosebery, who was Foreign Secretary and later to become Prime Minister of England. And Lord Rosebery was someone that Queensberry could not fight. He was too big, too powerful, though Queensberry loathed him. But that he did make his son and heir, Francis, feel dreadful about this relationship. He went around the place insulting Rosebery when Rosebery wasn't there, calling him that Jew, cur, sod. I mean, really horrible language. And Francis had an accident with a gun, which is usually a suicide, it must be said. And I think Wilde was genuinely concerned that Queensberry was dangerous and would cause the same thing in Bosie, would threaten Bosie's stability to such an extent that Bosie would either do something mad like kill his father, which is quite conceivable. He was perfectly capable of going around in the heat of a temper with a gun and shooting him, as he did threaten to do on many occasions.
Here's one for the Black Douglas.
Bosie, for God's sake!
And one for his liver, one for his light, one for his stinking rotten soul!
Bosie!
I'll save one for myself. My own father. He wants to kill me.
I committed to Stephen after our first meeting, and I never wavered from that choice. And the reasons were various, because it was not, oddly enough, although it seems a very obvious choice to people now, it wasn't an obvious choice for us in many senses, some practical and some for other reasons. The practical ones that Stephen was not very well known in film. He's done several cameos in some recognised films, but he's never led a film. And so it wasn't particularly convenient or easy to raise money on Stephen's name.
The financing was very complicated to put together. Ultimately, we had investment from Japan, Germany, the United States, as well as the UK. Something like 8 different investors, but the whole thing wouldn't have worked were it not for the Arts Council's investment of lottery money. There's a new scheme under which money raised from the lottery is invested in films, and this has been the backbone of the wave of new British films now coming through. Wilde would not have been made without that investment.
So, you think you can play Oscar Wilde, do you? You said yourself. And without the absolute confidence in a director, without absolute confidence in everyone working around you, it would have been impossible. You have to trust the director's instincts on every shot, that when he says cut, print, move on to the next scene. You have to trust that the director can see every mannerism, every trick that you might employ lazily or out of fear, and can iron it out of you and get precisely the thing that's needed for each moment.
And the giant's heart melted as he looked out. "How selfish I have been," he said. "Now I know why the spring would not come here. I will put that little boy on top of the tree, and I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground for ever and ever." He was really very sorry for what he had done.
I'm not sure that I do understand what went on in Oscar's mind, and I don't think one ever can. I think all one can say is that he certainly led, if not a double life, a kind of triple life in a way. That he was a public man with a public image. He was almost the template, the prototype of a modern celebrity in some ways. There were cartoons of him in Punch and similar magazines way before he'd ever written anything valuable or lasting, simply because of the way he was, the way he walked, the way he talked. So he had that side to him, but he also had the private family side as a husband and father. And he had the third side, which was a secret one, which was his life as a homosexual, as someone who had male lovers. And that was something, I don't know what kind of pressure there was on that. I think he had the self-destructive streak that almost made him long to be found out, which is something I can understand. I know that feeling. I can't imagine, I don't think any of us can really grasp what it meant when he was publicly tried like that. I mean, people quite literally, there are reports of people literally vomiting in the streets when they read the newspapers. That's how alien this whole idea was to them. They could not believe such things existed. And yet somehow, of course, inside they knew they did, because what disturbed them was that it somehow connected with their own desires or perhaps their own school experiences. None of that is any different to the way it was. But it was just untalked of. And when something is suddenly brought up to public notice, which has always been a dark secret, people react in very extraordinary ways.
I have fame. I have recognition. With 2 plays about to open in London. I may even have money. The world is at my command, yet I can't command myself. I can't command my feelings for you.
If anybody seeing the film likes Oscar or values Oscar, the character of Oscar Wilde, enough in the film to read what he wrote, then I think they will discover that they are in the presence, as they turn every page, of a quite gigantic intellect and a quite monumental spirit, one of the greatest of his or any other age. And it's quite common in Germany or France or Russia to talk about Tolstoy, Dostoevsky and Wilde in the same breath.